The small village of St. Mary Mead was quietly stirring on the first morning of the new year. Frost had glazed the hedgerows in a delicate, silvery sheen, and the smoke from cottage chimneys curled lazily into the pale winter sky. Inside the neat houses, families moved about with the brisk efficiency that accompanied the promise of a new beginning, while the lingering warmth of festive cheer still hummed faintly in the background. At the heart of the village, the stately yet comfortable home of Lady Ethel Mayhew was abuzz with unusual activity. The grand dining room, normally reserved for modest Sunday lunches and occasional bridge games, was transformed into a veritable tableau of festivity. Crystal glasses shimmered on the polished mahogany table, and an intricate arrangement of winter flowers filled the centerpiece with bursts of muted color. Lady Mayhew, a formidable woman with a reputation for precision, flitted about in a swirl of silk and pearls, making sure that each chair was perfectly aligned and each napkin meticulously folded. "I do hope the luncheon is not too early for anyone," she said to the assembled guests, her voice carrying a note of authority, softened by genuine hospitality. Her eyes, however, missed nothing, a habit that had earned her both admiration and mild fear in equal measure over the years. Among the first arrivals was Miss Jane Marple herself, arriving in her customary quiet manner. She had chosen her well-worn grey coat, buttoned neatly against the winter chill, and carried a small hand-stitched handbag that bore the faint scent of lavender. The village had grown accustomed to seeing Miss Marple at gatherings, though they often underestimated her presence, dismissing her as a kindly old lady with a fondness for knitting and village gossip. In truth, her eyes, clear and penetrating, missed little. They observed the subtlest changes in expression, the slightest hesitation in conversation. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Lady Mayhew greeted warmly, though with an edge of pride. "I do hope you will forgive the early hour. New Year's luncheons always seem to require a certain punctuality." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her lips barely parting. "I should think nothing of it, Lady Mayhew. One must make the most of the early hours, when everyone is still sober from the celebrations." Her words elicited a ripple of gentle laughter from the room. Other guests soon arrived, the young and earnest Dr. Philip Carter, whose neatly combed hair and eager smile betrayed a man who was perpetually on the cusp of proving himself. The charming but vaguely aloof Miss Claudia Henley, who carried an air of refinement mingled with a streak of impatience. Mr. George Pendleton, a retired banker whose reputation for shrewdness was matched only by a tendency toward abruptness, and Mrs. Edith Stokes, whose vivid hat and flamboyant scarves seemed almost a statement of defiance against the greyness of January. Each guest took their place with the polite grace expected in St. Mary Mead, yet Miss Marple noted a subtle undercurrent in their movements, a tension, a flicker of unease as if something unspoken lingered in the air. The luncheon commenced with the usual formalities. Lady Mayhew's servants, discreet and efficient, poured steaming cups of tea while platters of delicate sandwiches and fresh fruit were passed along the table. The conversation was light, touching on local events, the mildness of the winter and the inevitable reflections on resolutions made and broken. Yet beneath the polite smiles and measured phrases, Miss Marple detected a series of small fissures, slight wrinkles of annoyance, a flicker of envy in the eyes of one guest, the barely perceptible stiffening of posture in another. It was Dr. Carter who first broke the rhythm of casual chatter with a remark that, on the surface, seemed innocent enough. "I heard that the old rectory near the green has been sold. Quite suddenly, too. The new owner appears to be taking residence immediately." A faint ripple of interest ran through the table. "Indeed?" said Mr. Pendleton, his voice tight. "I did hear something of the sort, though I cannot imagine anyone in the village wanting that dreary place at this time of year." "Perhaps," Miss Marple interjected softly, "it is merely the attraction of a quiet corner. A house with character often appeals when the rest of the world is bustling." Lady Mayhew, ever conscious of maintaining her luncheon's decorum, clinked her spoon gently against her teacup. "Character, yes. Though some might find the rectory a little forbidding." The conversation drifted to other matters, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the brief flurry of responses. Each guest's reaction, subtle as it was, revealed more than they intended. There was curiosity, certainly, but also hesitation, a faint shadow of apprehension. Human behavior, Miss Marple thought, often spoke louder than words. It was then, just as Lady Mayhew was rising to summon the next course, that the tranquillity of the morning was shattered. A piercing scream echoed through the house, sharp and sudden, followed by the unmistakable sound of crashing porcelain. Guests leapt from their chairs, some nearly toppling their teacups in panic. Miss Marple rose slowly, her hands folded in front of her, her face calm but alert. Others rushed toward the sound, but she noted the exact moment when Mr. Pendleton paused, his eyes narrowing. And Miss Henley's fingers trembled against the edge of the table. In the corridor leading to the library, where the commotion had originated, a scene unfolded that would be remembered in St. Mary Mead for years to come. On the Persian rug lay the lifeless body of Mr. Harold Whitcomb, the village solicitor, his face pale and still, one hand reaching futilely toward a toppled bookcase. A fine cut across his temple hinted at the violence of his fall, or perhaps, as Miss Marple would soon deduce, something more sinister. For a moment, the room was silent, save for Lady Mayhew's sharp gasp. Then, in a chorus of panic, questions and exclamations erupted. Who had done this? How could it have happened? Who would wish harm on Harold Whitcomb, a man universally regarded as meticulous, if not occasionally pedantic? Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the doorway, observed. Not the body itself, not the scattered books or the overturned chair, but the reactions, the way each guest's eyes darted, the faint tightening of lips, the brief glances exchanged. Every movement, she knew, would tell a story if one only paid attention, and Miss Marple, with the patience born of years spent unraveling the subtleties of human nature, was already beginning to listen. By the time the constable arrived, St. Mary Mead was abuzz with a nervous energy that belied the tranquil appearance of the village. Word of Mr. Harold Whitcomb's death had travelled swiftly, carried in whispers, hastily exchanged glances, and the subdued yet urgent tones of telephone calls. The New Year's luncheon, once a source of gentle social pride, now seemed suspended in an uneasy silence, the bright decorations of Lady Mayhew's dining room contrasting sharply with the grimness of the incident. Miss Marple had taken her usual position by the window, quietly observing the assembled guests. The constable, a young man with a keen sense of duty but limited experience in matters of human deceit, made his initial rounds, asking the obvious questions and recording the immediate facts. Time of death, location of the body, and a description of the scene. Yet it was in the faces of the villagers that Miss Marple found the true clues, the subtle betrayals of conscience, the imperceptible tremors of guilt or fear, the faint relief of those who had secrets of their own and were glad the attention was elsewhere. It was Mrs. Edith Stokes who first voiced what many were already thinking aloud in hushed tones. But who could have done such a thing? Harold Whitcomb was always so careful, so proper, and everyone liked him. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the tension she hoped to mask with concern. Proper, yes, said Mr. George Pendleton, frowning, but sometimes proper can be insufferable. Always pointing out the errors of others, correcting, advising. One could imagine someone growing tired of it. His tone was measured, almost casual, but Miss Marple noted the slight narrowing of his eyes, the tightening around his mouth. He was revealing a personal opinion under the guise of detached observation, a common human slip. Miss Claudia Henley, with her fine features almost unnaturally composed, shook her head. It is absurd to speculate before the police have had a proper look. We are in no position to judge the circumstances. And yet, the flutter of her hands, the small hesitations as she spoke, suggested to Miss Marple a mind already at work, weighing possibilities, calculating social advantage. Even Lady Mayhew, who had prided herself on maintaining decorum, now seemed slightly off balance. She moved from guest to guest, offering reassurances that sounded more like perfunctory statements than genuine comfort. Yes, yes. We must remain calm. Constable, I do hope you understand. This is most distressing. But one must act sensibly in such matters. Her voice carried authority. Yet her eyes flickered toward each guest, searching, measuring, perhaps already wondering which secrets might emerge once formal investigation began. Miss Marple, in contrast, spoke softly, almost as an aside, yet with the clarity that commanded attention. It is curious, she remarked to no one in particular, how everyone believes the murder affects only the immediate victim, Often, the ripple of a single action touches far more than one might imagine. No one responded immediately, but her words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge to consider the broader implications. Gossip began to spread with astonishing speed. The village, small and intimate, thrived on knowledge of its neighbours, and a murder presented fertile ground. Mrs. Stokes whispered to Miss Henley about the late solicitor's rumoured disputes over land inheritance. Mr. Pendleton quietly reminded the group of Harold Whitcomb's recent arguments with several clients, including a particularly disagreeable farmer who had protested over a boundary dispute. Even the youngest guests, who had come for the luncheon more out of social obligation than genuine interest, found themselves listening intently, repeating half-formed theories in murmured tones. As the hour passed, constable reports continued. Nothing had been stolen. No forced entry was apparent. The body had been discovered near the library's central rug, as Lady Mayhew had already described. All indications suggested that the fall had not been entirely accidental, but the method remained elusive. Miss Marple, in her unobtrusive manner, took note of these details without alarm, storing them as she had so often done in her mind's orderly catalogue. Meanwhile, subtle tensions began to surface. Miss Henley was first to betray impatience, glancing repeatedly toward the door, as if hoping the investigation would conclude swiftly so the luncheon could continue, or perhaps so she could remove herself from the scene. Mrs. Stokes, on the other hand, seemed eager to display shock. Her gestures exaggerated, her eyes darting about to see who else noticed her distress. Mr. Pendleton, ever watchful, studied each reaction, calculating motives with the precision of a retired banker assessing risk. Miss Marple observed all of it quietly, sipping her tea with deliberate care. It was not the apparent distress that interested her, nor the surface-level politeness of the villagers, but the small, nearly invisible betrayals of true feeling. A clenched hand hidden beneath a tablecloth, the brief flicker of a glance, the unconscious mimicry of another's tension, these were the markers of human truth. And it was in these markers that she would find the key to unravelling what had truly occurred. The luncheon, meant to celebrate the turning of the year, had taken on an air of peculiar solemnity. Conversation, once light and full of expectation for the coming months, now revolved around speculation and rumour. Some whispered of accidents. Others quietly suggested darker motives. A sense of distrust, subtle but growing, began to weave itself into the fabric of the gathering, altering relationships that had once seemed entirely ordinary. Miss Marple, for her part, made no outward indication that she was piecing these fragments together. To the casual observer, she appeared merely contemplative, an elderly lady pondering a minor social inconvenience. But in truth, she was already forming a web of human connections and subtle motives in her mind, anticipating the interplay of character and circumstance that would soon reveal the murderer. And as the afternoon sun slanted through the frost-specked windows, casting pale light across the dining room, the first threads of insight began to coalesce. Miss Marple, quietly attentive, had begun to see the outline of the story behind the incident. A story that no gossip, no rumour, no outward display of grief or shock could yet reveal, but which would soon become apparent in the most unexpected of ways. The morning after the luncheon, the village of St. Mary Mead was enveloped in a quiet that felt more uneasy than peaceful. The frost had retreated slightly, leaving damp tracks along the narrow lanes, and the first hints of winter sun glimmered weakly on the rooftops. The streets, normally filled with the gentle bustle of daily errands, were subdued. People moved with a measured pace, heads down, speaking in hushed tones or avoiding conversation altogether. The incident at Lady Mayhew's luncheon had left an indelible impression. Miss Marple, who had spent the night quietly reflecting on the events, arrived at the scene with a sense of deliberate purpose. She had not been summoned by the constable, nor had anyone expected her presence to be of consequence. Yet as she approached the Mayhew residence, she observed the subtle choreography of the household, servants moving with careful efficiency, Lady Mayhew herself attending to minor tasks with a pale composure, and a faint tension that seemed to permeate even the air itself. Constable Reynolds greeted her politely, but with visible surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "I wasn't expecting you this early. I hope you will excuse the disorder. We are still cataloguing details and taking statements. Miss Marple inclined her head. Good morning, Constable. There is no disorder that cannot be observed quietly. May I have a look around? Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but carried a subtle authority that left no room for refusal. The constable led her first to the library, where Mr. Whitcomb had met his untimely end. The room, now cleared of the initial chaos, bore the faint traces of disruption. A toppled bookcase, books scattered in uneven piles, a chair overturned at an odd angle. Yet the floor itself, polished and unremarkable, revealed nothing in the way of footprints or physical struggle. On the wall opposite the fireplace, a portrait of the late solicitor's father hung slightly askew, a minor detail perhaps, but Miss Marple's attention lingered. She noted the faint scratch on the frame, the precise alignment of the books on the nearest shelf, the subtle dust displacement along the edge of the rug. Everything appears as it was, Constable Reynolds said, as if to reassure both himself and her. No sign of forced entry, nothing stolen. Most curious indeed. Curious, yes, Miss Marple agreed softly, her eyes never still. She allowed her gaze to drift to the window and beyond, observing the frost on the garden path and the way the morning sun illuminated the edge of the rose bushes. Even in these mundane details, she discerned patterns of movement, gestures of avoidance, and faint traces of hurried footsteps, small indications of human behavior that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. After her quiet survey, Miss Marple turned her attention to the gathered household and remaining guests. Lady Mayhew, her composure now a polished mask, was speaking with measured calm to Mrs. Stokes and Miss Henley, while Mr. Pendleton lingered near the doorway, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over each person in a silent evaluation. Miss Marple began her inquiries in her usual gentle manner, posing questions with the air of someone merely making conversation rather than conducting an investigation. I wonder, she said to Miss Henley, did you notice anything unusual about the arrangement of the books, or perhaps anything that seemed slightly out of place before the incident occurred? Miss Henley looked puzzled, as though Miss Marple's remark had caught her off guard. I cannot say that I did, she replied carefully. I was attending to my own seat, and then, well, everything happened so quickly. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured almost to herself, though loud enough for the others to hear. And yet, when things happen quickly, the smallest detail can often tell the truest story. Her words, soft and innocuous, left Miss Henley slightly unsettled, and Miss Marple noted the subtle tightening of her hands, the faint flush rising to her cheeks. Turning to Mr. Pendleton, she asked in the same unobtrusive tone, "You were present when Mr. Whitcomb was discovered. Did you notice anything that struck you as particularly unusual, perhaps in the way the others reacted?" Mr. Pendleton straightened, his pride as a retired banker bristling at what he perceived as a polite challenge. Unusual. I cannot say I did. It was a tragic event, nothing more. Reactions varied, as one would expect. Some were shocked, others distressed. I paid little attention to minor gestures. They are hardly relevant. Miss Marple only nodded, her expression serene, yet she had already catalogued Mr. Pendleton's posture, his tight-lipped comment, the calculated manner in which he avoided glances at certain guests. Human behavior, she mused, rarely conformed entirely to civility. Her attention next shifted to Mrs. Stokes, who was still visibly fluttering, fussing with her hat and gloves. "Were you frightened?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh, of course. Who wouldn't be?" Mrs. Stokes exclaimed, her voice trembling. "To think that something like this could happen here. It's terrible. I can hardly believe it." She glanced about, her eyes darting nervously, as if seeking reassurance from anyone nearby. Miss Marple noticed the slight unevenness in her breathing and the exaggerated motions of her hands, subtle signs of someone attempting to portray fear while hiding another emotion. Perhaps guilt or perhaps relief. Throughout the morning, Miss Marple's quiet observations continued. She noted the discrepancies between what each guest said and how they behaved, the faint marks of hurried movement, and the fleeting moments when eyes met or avoided one another. Even in their attempts at normalcy, the villagers revealed their true states of mind. By midday, it was apparent to Miss Marple that while the police had established the scene and recorded statements, the subtleties of human behavior had yet to be considered. The outward chaos was one thing. The inner currents, the hidden motives and private resentments were quite another. As she left the Mayhew residence to return home for a brief rest, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns she had begun to see. There were fissures in the veneer of civility, tiny openings through which truth might eventually emerge, and though she did not yet possess the full picture, she knew with quiet certainty that the solution to Mr. Whitcomb's death would not be found in the physical evidence alone. It would be discovered in the small, telling gestures of human nature, in the behavior that even the keenest eyes often overlooked. Miss Marple's mind was already weaving the intricate web, patiently connecting observations and subtle clues, waiting for the moment when the threads would converge into clarity. The early investigation had begun, but the heart of the mystery, the motives, the secrets, the truth, remained carefully hidden, waiting to be revealed. The village of St. Mary Mead had never been so tense. By the afternoon following the luncheon, Constable Reynolds had taken statements from nearly everyone in attendance, yet the mystery of Mr. Harold Whitcomb's death remained unsolved. In the eyes of the law, however, the search for a suspect had already begun. It was Mrs. Edith Stokes, ever eager to assert herself, who offered the first suggestion. "It must have been someone with a grudge," she exclaimed to anyone who would listen. "He was so precise, so rigid in his dealings. Surely someone must have resented him deeply." Her eyes flicked toward Mr. George Pendleton, who remained quietly observing, as if assessing whether Mrs. Stokes might incriminate herself through her haste to judge. The constable, inexperienced in reading subtleties, allowed himself to be swayed by the ease with which the accusation could be pinned. He had already noted that one guest in particular, a visiting relative of Lady Mayhew's, had seemed nervous and fidgety when first questioned. Indeed, the young man, Charles Hargreaves, had been relatively new to the village and had mingled little during the luncheon, keeping to the edges of conversation. His hands shook slightly whenever he spoke of his acquaintance with the deceased, and his explanations for being near the library seemed to the constable's eyes uncertain. "Mr. Hargreaves," Constable Reynolds began, "you were among the last to enter the library. Can you explain why you were there at that precise moment?" Charles stammered, his voice almost inaudible. I only went to retrieve a book for Lady Mayhew. It was nothing unusual." I wasn't—" His words faltered as he glanced around, the hint of panic in his wide eyes betraying his otherwise polite composure. "Quite," said the constable, nodding firmly. "We shall need you to remain in town until further inquiries are made. It is, of course, a mere precaution." Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly in the corner, listening with an expression of polite interest, said nothing. She had already noted several things that contradicted the surface narrative. The way Charles's hands trembled more when addressing certain villagers than others, the slight alignment of books on the shelf that suggested someone had deliberately restored them to their former order, and the subtle tension in Lady Mayhew's own posture when Charles was questioned. These were small, nearly invisible details, yet each carried meaning. Nevertheless, the young man's nervousness made him an easy target. To outsiders, he seemed guilty. To Constable Reynolds, he was the most convenient person upon whom suspicion could be cast. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She observed, quietly cataloguing the reactions of the others. Miss Claudia Henley, with her composed, almost imperious manner, suddenly spoke. "I find it curious," she said, her voice deliberate, "that we are so quick to accuse a newcomer. Perhaps, if one is to look carefully, the more familiar members of the household might hold greater responsibility. One does not stumble into tragedy by accident." Her words drew a brief glance from Mr. Pendleton, whose brow furrowed slightly, though he said nothing. Miss Marple, however, detected the subtle shift in Miss Henley's expression, the faint twitch of a lip, the controlled narrowing of her eyes. There was a thought hidden behind that calm exterior, one she intended to explore later. The constable, sensing the rising tension, attempted to steer the conversation back to more concrete matters. "For now, we must focus on the sequence of events. Who was nearest to Mr. Whitcomb when the incident occurred?" Several guests hesitated. Mrs. Stokes eagerly pointed toward Charles Hargreaves, while others murmured about the position of Mr. Pendleton and Lady Mayhew. Noting that the solicitor had been conversing with them moments before his fall, Miss Marple, listening quietly, was careful to note the small contradictions in their accounts. Mrs. Stokes described Harold as having turned toward the library window, while Lady Mayhew insisted he had been looking at the bookshelf. These discrepancies, though minor, were telling. After several minutes of polite, though increasingly tense discussion, Constable Reynolds allowed Charles Hargreaves to leave under the vague guise of supervision. The young man departed with a pallor that spoke of relief mingled with fear, leaving the village to continue its quiet speculations. Miss Marple lingered behind, observing those who remained. Lady Mayhew moved swiftly between guests, her movements precise, almost choreographed. She greeted each person with politeness, yet her eyes betrayed something unspoken, perhaps concern, perhaps calculation. Mr. Pendleton, who had remained detached for most of the morning, now leaned slightly toward Miss Henley, exchanging a brief, low-toned remark. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the subtle arch of his brow, the fleeting glance that seemed to acknowledge something only he and she might understand. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured under her breath. "The surface is never the truth. One must look beneath the politeness, the fear, the obvious explanations." Her attention then returned to Mrs. Stokes, who was busy readjusting her gloves, as though to demonstrate that she had recovered composure. Yet Miss Marple noticed a small, nearly imperceptible detail, a smudge of dirt along the cuff of Mrs. Stokes's sleeve, one that could not have been there merely by chance. It was minor, almost laughably so to anyone untrained in observation, yet it suggested movement, perhaps in haste, perhaps during the moment of the incident. In the background, Miss Marple began to piece together the early threads of human behavior that would guide her investigation. There was the obvious suspect, the newcomer whose nervousness made him a convenient target. There were those who sought to deflect suspicion with bravado or composure, and there were subtle hints in body language, fleeting gestures, and unguarded expressions that pointed toward truths yet unspoken. By the time the afternoon waned, Miss Marple had already determined several things without a single word of accusation. She knew that the first suspect, while nervous and unsettled, was unlikely to have the motive or the subtle cunning required to commit such a crime. She also knew that there were layers of resentment and hidden interactions among the villagers that would need careful unraveling. The real work, she recognized, was not in chasing the obvious, but in observing the hidden, and so, with the early investigation drawing attention to Charles Hargreaves as a convenient suspect, Miss Marple chose a different path. She would watch, she would listen, and she would wait for the moment when the human truths, so often disguised behind polite manners, would reveal themselves in full. Miss Marple returned to the Mayhew residence the following morning, the chill of winter still clinging to the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead. The household was quieter now. The initial tension slightly softened by routine, though a certain unease lingered in the air. Lady Mayhew moved about with her usual efficiency, though her hands trembled ever so slightly when arranging the breakfast table. Miss Marple, observing from her customary corner near the window, noted these subtle tremors as the kind of detail most people dismissed, but which often revealed far more than words ever could. The library, where Mr. Whitcomb had met his untimely end, had been cleared and tidied, yet Miss Marple noticed small imperfections that hinted at hurried restoration. The rug lay perfectly straight, the chair returned to its customary position, and the books were aligned meticulously on the shelves. A casual observer might have believed the room entirely ordinary. To Miss Marple, each detail was a carefully arranged fragment of human behavior, a clue to be read between the lines. As she wandered slowly among the familiar furniture, Miss Marple's eyes fell upon a small object at the edge of the rug, a silver cufflink, partially hidden beneath the fringe. It was faint, almost imperceptible to anyone not specifically looking, and it seemed entirely out of place. She picked it up delicately, turning it over in her fingers. The engraving, a small, almost whimsical swirl, was distinctive, though it did not belong to Mr. Whitcomb. Its presence suggested someone had been close to him, perhaps within arm's reach at the critical moment. Miss Marple's mind began to piece together possibilities. A cufflink, left behind inadvertently, could point to the person who had approached too near, or it could be a deliberate distraction, placed to mislead observers. Either way, it was a detail that demanded attention. She slipped it into her handkerchief, knowing that the observation, though trivial to others, would be essential in unraveling the puzzle. Later that morning, the village began to stir with renewed gossip. Mrs. Stokes, who had spent much of the previous day asserting her shock, now spoke in quieter tones, consulting Miss Henley about minor observations, as if seeking to corroborate her own impressions. Mr. Pendleton, with his habitual reserve, observed from the periphery, while Lady Mayhew continued to flit among the rooms, maintaining the appearance of composed control. The household, outwardly orderly, was quietly shifting in response to the lingering presence of the unsolved mystery. Miss Marple seated herself near the window once again, her keen eyes tracking the subtle movements of the villagers. She noted Mrs. Stokes fidgeting with her gloves more often than seemed necessary, Miss Henley's slight hesitation when speaking, and Mr. Pendleton's occasional, almost imperceptible glances toward the library. The cufflink, small though it was, had opened a new avenue of observation. It suggested a proximity and a familiarity with Mr. Whitcomb that could not be overlooked. Her thoughts were interrupted by Lady Mayhew herself, who approached with a polite, slightly anxious smile. "Miss Marple," she began, "I do hope you are not causing trouble with your investigations. It is most distressing to have everyone so unsettled." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I assure you, Lady Mayhew, I mean no trouble. I'm merely observing as one does. Sometimes the smallest details tell the truest story." She paused briefly, allowing the words to settle. "For instance," she added gently, "an item left behind, seemingly insignificant, can often be more revealing than the loudest accusations." Lady Mayhew's eyes flicked toward the cufflink Miss Marple had withdrawn from her pocket. Her lips pursed slightly, a subtle sign of curiosity or perhaps concern. "I see," she murmured, nodding slowly. "Small things do tend to escape notice, though I dare say no one could have intended mischief here." Miss Marple inclined her head. Intent is often hidden beneath layers of human behavior. Observing without interruption allows one to distinguish what is deliberate from what is accidental. With this, Miss Marple began to question the household staff in her unassuming, gentle manner. She spoke first with Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, a woman whose devotion to order rivaled that of Lady Mayhew herself. "Mrs. Cartwright," Miss Marple asked, "did you notice anyone adjusting the library furniture or moving items yesterday after the incident?" Mrs. Cartwright blinked, startled. I thought Mr. Hargreaves moved the chair, ma'am. Or perhaps it was Mr. Pendleton. Everyone was so flustered it is difficult to say exactly. I did see Miss Henley bend to pick up a fallen book, though I cannot be certain of what she touched after that." Miss Marple nodded, taking note of the subtle implications. Human recollection was notoriously flawed under stress, but the consistency of small gestures, bending, adjusting, moving, was worth consideration. She made no outward judgment, yet each remark further shaped the outline of the mystery in her mind. Later, she spoke to Lady Mayhew's maid, young Elsie, who confessed with wide eyes, "I noticed that Mr. Whitcomb seemed anxious just before he entered the library. He kept glancing around as if expecting someone or something." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion of the man himself, but at the circumstances surrounding the moment. Anxiety, fleeting as it may be, could indicate knowledge of an imminent confrontation. Combined with the presence of the cufflink, it suggested a closeness between Mr. Whitcomb and the person who had left it behind, a proximity potentially fatal. By afternoon, Miss Marple had returned home, her mind quietly sorting the observations and the small, telling clue she had discovered. The cufflink, innocuous in appearance, had already revealed more than the police had discerned in days of investigation. It was a small physical testament to human behavior, carelessness, presence, and possibly guilt. She considered the possibilities. Who had been near Mr. Whitcomb at the moment of his fall? Who might have had reason to approach him with intent, yet disguise their movements under the guise of ordinary behavior? The answers would not be found in the obvious suspect, Charles Hargreaves, whose nervousness was genuine, but not tied to motive. The true solution lay elsewhere, in someone whose outward composure concealed inner turbulence. Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. This hidden clue had set the stage for everything that would follow. The cufflink was not merely an object. It was a signal, a silent witness to the human actions that had led to Mr. Whitcomb's death. Observing its implications patiently would bring her closer to uncovering the truth. and so she resolved to watch, to wait, and to listen even more carefully. Human nature, after all, was rarely deceptive to those who knew how to read its subtle language. In the quiet of her home, Miss Marple smiled faintly, certain that the threads of the mystery were beginning to unravel in ways invisible to the untrained eye. By mid-afternoon, the quiet unease in St. Mary Mead had begun to crystallize into whispered confrontations and subtle exposures of long-hidden secrets. Miss Marple, who had spent the morning reflecting on the small cufflink she had discovered, returned once more to Lady Mayhew's residence, determined to observe the villagers' interactions without drawing attention to herself. Human behavior, after all, rarely conformed to politeness when provoked by anxiety or guilt. The first stirrings came from Mrs. Edith Stokes, whose excitement over the ongoing investigation could no longer be contained. She approached Miss Henley in a deliberate whisper, her voice tinged with triumph. "I happened to overhear Lady Mayhew speaking to Mr. Pendleton," she said, lowering her voice as though she feared the walls themselves might betray her. "She mentioned something about Harold Whitcomb and, well, old disputes, matters of property. Did you know anything about that?" Miss Henley's response was calm, measured, yet her eyes betrayed the faintest shadow of concern. "I was aware that Mr. Whitcomb had engaged in several land negotiations over the past months," she replied. "But surely, Mrs. Stokes, you do not mean to suggest that such matters could lead to murder?" Mrs. Stokes hesitated, the edge of fear sharpening her tone. I only mean that it is odd, is all. People have tempers, you know. Old resentments linger." Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her gloves, a subtle admission of nerves under the guise of observation. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the window, noted every detail. The careful avoidance of direct eye contact, the slight tightening of lips, the fleeting glance toward Lady Mayhew as though seeking validation. She recognized these as minor betrayals, small fissures revealing hidden thoughts, unguarded intentions. Meanwhile, Mr. George Pendleton had sought out Lady Mayhew in a private corner of the room. Their conversation, though conducted in subdued tones, carried the weight of long-held familiarity. Miss Marple, with practiced subtlety, observed the slight tilt of Lady Mayhew's head, the faint contraction of her brow when certain topics arose. It was evident that the solicitor's death had reopened old concerns, perhaps disputes over inheritance, perhaps matters of reputation. Curiosity piqued. Miss Marple gently approached Mr. Pendleton, under the pretense of casual conversation. "You seem particularly attentive to the arrangements here, Mr. Pendleton," she remarked. "Do the details of the house strike you as significant?" He straightened slightly, adopting the posture of one prepared to defend propriety. "Merely noting consistency," he replied. "One's home ought to reflect order, and in a moment of shock such order may falter. I cannot claim any deeper insight." Miss Marple inclined her head, allowing him to believe his explanation satisfied her. In truth, she noted the tiny variations in his gestures, the minute hesitations in his speech, and the faint, nervous glance toward Miss Henley when he thought no one was observing. Human behavior, she mused, seldom lies entirely, no matter how carefully one constructs a facade. The day continued with further revelations. Miss Henley, in her usual poised manner, inadvertently exposed more than she intended when she recounted an unrelated story of a minor dispute over garden plots with Mr. Whitcomb. Her narrative, polished yet slightly defensive, hinted at ongoing tension that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Miss Marple, with a subtle arch of her brow, recognized the significance. The most seemingly trivial conflicts often festered beneath the surface, shaping interactions that could escalate under the right or wrong circumstances. Even Lady Mayhew, normally the epitome of composure, allowed a small detail to escape her vigilance. She mentioned, almost offhand, that Mr. Whitcomb had confided in her recently about an unsettled matter, speaking in a low tone that Miss Marple had only partially overheard. It was the sort of remark easily dismissed by casual listeners, yet to Miss Marple it indicated that someone held knowledge or grievance that might have precipitated the fatal incident. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had gathered further insight from the household staff, who, despite their deference, revealed personal observations when questioned with gentle patience. Mrs. Cartwright admitted that she had overheard Mr. Pendleton and Lady Mayhew speaking in hushed tones during the luncheon. Though she could not discern the content, young Elsie, the maid, revealed that she had seen Miss Henley and Charles Hargreaves speaking briefly before the incident, their conversation marked by an unusual tension, quickly broken when anyone approached. With each revelation, Miss Marple's understanding of the village's intricate web of relationships deepened. The surface harmony of St. Mary Mead had always been punctuated by private disputes and small acts of ambition, but the solicitor's death had illuminated them in a stark, unmistakable light. Jealousies, resentments, and personal grievances all seemed to converge within the household, creating a field of human motives as complex as any she had encountered. By evening, the atmosphere within Lady Mayhew's home had grown palpably strained. Guests moved cautiously, speaking with deliberate care. The undercurrent of suspicion was tangible, though unspoken. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the drawing-room, reflected on the subtleties she had observed. The first suspect, Charles Hargreaves, remained nervous yet unconvincing as the perpetrator. The real clues lay elsewhere, in the almost imperceptible signals of those whose social composure barely concealed private truths. A sudden movement in the corner drew her attention. Miss Henley had approached Lady Mayhew, their conversation hushed and urgent. Miss Marple noted the faint tension in Miss Henley's posture, the careful modulation of her voice, the rapid glance toward Mr. Pendleton before speaking. All suggested not casual discussion, but a deliberate sharing of information, perhaps secrets best kept hidden, perhaps hints of motive carefully calculated to avoid suspicion. It was in such moments, Miss Marple thought, that one could truly observe human nature. People often believed themselves skillful in concealment, yet the smallest gestures betrayed awareness, intent, and sometimes guilt. It was not in the obvious statements or overt actions that the truth lay, but in these subtle, almost invisible signals. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple rose to leave, her mind already weaving together the strands of what she had seen and heard. The confrontations had revealed much, layers of resentment, minor betrayals, and secrets long held beneath polite civility. Yet these revelations, though illuminating, were only pieces of a larger puzzle. Outside, the village appeared peaceful, though Miss Marple knew that beneath its placid surface, human behavior continued to shift and stir. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pursue further observations, focusing on the nuances she had already begun to notice. The hidden truths of St. Mary Mead were patient. They revealed themselves only to those willing to wait, to watch, and to interpret the silent language of the human heart. And as she walked home through the frost-tinged streets, Miss Marple felt the quiet thrill of anticipation. The pieces were slowly coming together, and soon she knew the web of secrets would tighten, bringing the truth into the open. The following morning dawned over St. Mary Mead with an unusual heaviness. A pale winter sun struggled to cut through the mist that clung to the narrow streets, casting a muted light over the village. Though the snow had melted in most places, the damp air carried an uncanny chill, as if nature itself were aware of the unrest stirred by Mr. Whitcomb's death. Villagers moved quietly, whispering behind gloved hands, casting furtive glances at one another, each hesitant to step fully into the day without reassurance. Miss Marple, having risen early as was her habit, strolled toward the Mayhew residence, her mind still turning over the subtle clues she had gathered. The cufflink, the furtive glances, the nervous gestures, they all pointed toward hidden layers of human interaction. She had no doubt that the initial suspect, Charles Hargreaves, was only a convenient diversion. Yet what she had not anticipated was the turn that the day itself would take. Upon her arrival, a commotion in the kitchen announced the presence of unexpected news. Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, was flustered, her apron askew, her hands trembling, as she gestured toward a small group clustered near the back door. Lady Mayhew appeared beside her, composed but tense, and Miss Marple immediately sensed the urgency in her posture. "What has happened?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her voice calm despite the quickening pulse of curiosity within her. "It's Mr. Hargreaves," Lady Mayhew said, her tone carefully measured. "He has fainted or perhaps been taken ill outside in the garden. The doctor has been called." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. "Taken ill?" she repeated. "Do you know the cause?" "Not yet," Lady Mayhew replied. He was discovered near the rose bushes, pale and trembling, unable to stand. It is quite sudden." Miss Marple walked toward the garden with composed determination, noting the expressions of the villagers as they parted to make way. There was a peculiar mix of fear, curiosity and relief in their faces, a silent acknowledgement that the focus of suspicion had shifted once more. Charles Hargreaves, now seated on a low bench, was pale, his hands gripping the edge as if to steady himself. His wide eyes betrayed genuine fright, but Miss Marple observed more than simple anxiety. There was a hint of deliberate avoidance in his posture, a subtle attempt to control where his gaze fell and what he revealed to those around him. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said softly, kneeling to his level, "you are quite safe. May I inquire what happened?" He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I felt dizzy, Miss Marple. I don't know why. I was walking near the library window and then everything went dark. I cannot explain it." Miss Marple's gaze drifted over the garden, her eyes noting the precise alignment of the rose bushes, the slightly damp soil along the pathway, and the footprints that led to the bench. Nothing seemed outwardly unusual, yet she sensed there was more here than mere faintness. Small inconsistencies, too precise a placement of the garden tools, a faint disturbance in the soil near the path, suggested human intervention, subtle and deliberate. As she helped Charles to a sitting position, Miss Henley approached, her composure slightly ruffled. "I hope he is all right," she said, though her eyes lingered longer than polite concern would require. Miss Marple observed the minuscule twitch in her lips, the way her hands clasped each other tightly, a silent signal of anxiety or perhaps guilt. Before Miss Marple could inquire further, Lady Mayhew's voice interrupted. "We have just received word from the doctor. He believes Mr. Hargreaves is not ill in the ordinary sense. There may have been a mild reaction to something in the garden, perhaps a plant or an irritant, but nothing life-threatening." Miss Marple inclined her head, her mind turning over the new information. A reaction to a plant seemed plausible on the surface, yet it did not account for the precise timing, nor did it explain the placement of certain objects along the path. She noted, too, the brief hesitation in Lady Mayhew's announcement, the way her eyes flicked toward Mr. Pendleton, and the faint tightening of her jaw. The constable arrived shortly afterward, his steps brisk, a notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, "we have another incident, minor as it may be, but it is remarkable in its timing. It seems Mr. Hargreaves's fainting occurred in the very path that Mr. Whitcomb had used during the luncheon." Miss Marple's gaze followed the constable's hand as he indicated the walkway. Her sharp eyes caught a slight indentation in the soil, the faintest scuff mark that suggested movement not entirely natural. There was deliberation here, planning, a hand guiding events in a direction that would mislead observers. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else, "this is a small warning or an attempt to distract from the original act. People often underestimate the significance of human fear and its timing." As the villagers gathered, whispering anxiously among themselves, Miss Marple noted the subtle interactions. Mr. Pendleton moved quietly, his hands behind his back, watching both Charles and Miss Henley with an intensity that was almost imperceptible, but entirely telling to someone attentive. Lady Mayhew maintained her composed air, yet the occasional glance over her shoulder betrayed concern for how her guests might interpret events. Mrs. Stokes, predictably, was quick to draw her own conclusions. "It's clear, isn't it?" she whispered dramatically to a small cluster. "Something or someone is trying to frighten Mr. Hargreaves, perhaps to cover their own tracks. How else could he collapse in the garden?" Miss Marple said nothing, allowing the theory to linger. Every word spoken, every whisper carried additional clues, fears, motives, and reactions that spoke louder than the surface narrative. By late afternoon, it became clear that Mr. Hargreaves's collapse had shifted suspicion. The original police focus on him as the first suspect was complicated by this unexpected incident. Miss Marple, however, discerned something deeper. This twist, the fainting, the timing, the subtle disturbances, was a deliberate move in a hidden game, one orchestrated by someone who understood how human attention could be manipulated. As she departed, Miss Marple reflected on the chain of events. The first murder had revealed tensions, hidden grievances and behavioral anomalies. The second unexpected twist had confirmed her suspicions. The true culprit was cunning, careful, and capable of exploiting fear to distract attention. The threads were converging, but the pattern remained incomplete, requiring further observation and the quiet, patient unraveling of human behavior. Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, piecing together motives, timing, and subtle actions. The mystery, once seemingly straightforward, had deepened. Someone in St. Mary Mead was playing a careful, dangerous game, and the true solution would require all of her patience, subtlety, and insight to reveal. The evening air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, carrying the faint scent of burning wood and the muted echo of church bells in the distance. Within the Mayhew residence, the household had resumed a semblance of routine, though an underlying tension lingered like a shadow. Guests and villagers moved cautiously, their conversations measured, as if fearful of inadvertently revealing more than intended. Miss Marple, however, observed with her usual calm, aware that the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align. It was during tea that she initiated her subtle test, a quiet experiment in human behavior, designed not to confront but to observe. With her cup delicately poised in hand, she seated herself where she could casually oversee interactions without attracting undue attention. The others, believing themselves unobserved, soon relaxed, or at least they allowed themselves to appear so. "Mr. Pendleton," Miss Marple began, her voice mild, almost conversational. "You were quite involved with Mr. Whitcomb in certain matters of the estate, were you not? I imagine it is not uncommon for disagreements to arise in such business." The solicitor's posture stiffened imperceptibly, his fingers tightening around his teacup. "Well, naturally one must manage affairs with precision," he replied, careful to keep his tone neutral. "There are, of course, differences of opinion in any undertaking." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed with gentle curiosity, as if she were more interested in the tea than in his words. Yet she observed every nuance, the fraction of a second he took before responding, the subtle contraction of his jaw, the rapid blink of his left eye. These were the signs of controlled emotion, the faint tremors of a mind aware it was being watched with insight far beyond ordinary perception. Nearby, Lady Mayhew stirred her tea, ostensibly preoccupied with her own cup. Yet Miss Marple noticed the slight stiffening of her shoulders as Mr. Pendleton spoke. It was a reaction of alignment, protective, cautious. Small unnoticed gestures often carried the weight of truth in ways spoken words could not convey. Miss Marple then addressed Miss Henley, her tone no different than if she were merely commenting on the weather. "I wonder," she mused, "if one truly knows the disposition of those around them. For example, a visitor might appear nervous in one moment, but the same person could display remarkable composure when it is least expected. How curious, don't you think?" Miss Henley's hand paused over her saucer, a delicate gesture halted mid-motion. Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, then darted away. There was a subtle inflection in her breathing, a tiny flush to her cheeks that spoke of discomfort. To any casual observer, she seemed unaffected, but Miss Marple recognized these cues as indicators of concealed emotion, a heart aware of scrutiny. By now, several villagers had joined the tea, drawn by polite obligation, curiosity, or simple social habit. Mrs. Stokes lingered near the periphery, her gloved hands wringing nervously, eager to witness confirmation of her own theories. Mr. Pendleton and Miss Henley exchanged glances, brief and quick, as though silently negotiating unspoken messages. Miss Marple, in her gentle way, observed all without comment, her mind quietly assembling the behavior, the timing, and the micro-expressions that revealed far more than speech ever could. Then, casually, she brought the discussion to a critical point. "It is remarkable," she said, her tone as airy as a passing comment, "how an object can betray more than words. One might leave something behind, and it could tell a story no one else is aware of. The smallest detail often escapes notice, yet it is the truest witness of all." The room went silent for a heartbeat, though no one dared look directly at her. Miss Marple, in truth, was referring to the cufflink she had discovered in the library, the seemingly minor item that had set the course for her observations. Her comment was indirect, gentle, yet it had the effect of causing subtle shifts in posture, micro-expressions that revealed unease. Miss Henley's hand flexed slightly, fingers brushing the edge of her saucer. Mr. Pendleton's gaze, though polite, briefly flicked toward the table where Miss Marple's own cup rested. Lady Mayhew, despite her composed exterior, hesitated in pouring more tea, her movements uncharacteristically slow. Even Mrs. Stokes, ever eager for drama, leaned forward instinctively, her curiosity sharp and insistent. Miss Marple's strategy was simple, though brilliantly subtle. Provoke reactions without accusation, expose inner truths without confrontation. Human behavior, she knew, was rarely perfectly masked when attention was both patient and attentive. The faintest indications, hesitations, gestures, shifts of gaze, often revealed what the spoken word could not. She allowed the pause to linger, sipping her tea with deliberate leisure, observing the interplay. Each subtle reaction was catalogued in her mind. The blink, the twitch, the hand flexing, the slight lean away or toward. Patterns emerged, linking gestures with proximity to the event, aligning motive with opportunity. The game, as she had anticipated, revealed itself in layers. After several moments, Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, conversational, and entirely unthreatening. Of course, it is quite possible for fear to masquerade as innocence, just as confidence can hide culpability. One must be careful, or the truth may slip past unnoticed. The reaction was instantaneous, though subtle. Miss Henley's eyebrows lifted fractionally, a brief tightening of her lips betraying surprise. Mr. Pendleton's hands, previously relaxed, now gripped his teacup with a hint of tension. Lady Mayhew's glance toward the window lingered, as if seeking reassurance from the outside world rather than from the room. Miss Marple noted these cues with quiet satisfaction. The trap, invisible to all, was set. No one spoke further. The room's air seemed to thicken with tension, though each individual believed themselves in polite conversation. Miss Marple's test had achieved its purpose. She had observed reactions that confirmed her suspicions, noted the alignment of gestures with knowledge of the crime, and discerned where anxiety, guilt, and self-interest intersected. By the time tea concluded, Miss Marple had not uttered a word of accusation, yet she had achieved far more than any direct inquiry could have done. The true culprit's nervous control and carefully measured actions had betrayed them, revealed in the minutiae of behavior and timing. As the villagers departed for the evening, each retreating to their respective homes with polite farewells, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind quietly assembling the final threads of the mystery. The first suspect had been a diversion, the fainting episode a manufactured distraction, and the subtle behaviors observed during tea had confirmed the deeper pattern she had sensed all along. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her shawl, her eyes reflecting the quiet triumph of insight. She understood the layers of deception, the human frailties exploited, and the intricate interplay of motive, opportunity, and concealed intent. Tomorrow she would move to the final stage, subtle confrontation, gentle guidance, and the ultimate revelation of the murderer. In St. Mary Mead, the night fell calm on the surface, yet beneath it, human truth stirred, waiting for the quiet mind that knew how to observe, interpret, and untangle the web of secrets. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke under a pale winter sun, its streets hushed with a quiet anticipation. The events of the past days had left the village in a state of subtle unrest, the ordinary rhythms of daily life tinged with suspicion and curiosity. Miss Marple, ever composed, had arranged for a private gathering at Lady Mayhew's residence, a meeting that, while outwardly social, served a more deliberate purpose. Lady Mayhew, though outwardly gracious, appeared slightly anxious as she ushered the villagers into the drawing-room. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice polite yet hesitant, "I hope this gathering will not cause any inconvenience. The household, I trust, is entirely at your disposal." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with mild amusement. "Thank you, Lady Mayhew. I have no doubt your hospitality will make everyone feel at ease." She had, of course, no intention of discussing mere pleasantries. The final act of her investigation required that all the players be present, that she could watch them, and that she could gently draw out the truth. The villagers took their seats, some relaxed, others tense, and Miss Marple began in her usual unassuming manner. "I have had the pleasure of observing many things over the past days," she said softly, "and it strikes me that people often reveal far more than they intend, if one knows how to watch." She glanced around the room with polite attention, as if the words were idle musings rather than the prelude to revelation. Her gaze lingered on Charles Hargreaves, who appeared both nervous and relieved, unaware that his fainting incident had already removed him from the immediate suspicion in the minds of others. Mr. Pendleton, whose professional demeanor often suggested control, now shifted slightly in his seat, an almost imperceptible tension in his posture. Miss Henley, elegant and poised, showed subtle signs of unease, a quick blink, a tightening of her lips, the ever-so-slight flexing of her fingers. Miss Marple began gently, addressing the group as a whole. "Let us consider the events of the luncheon, not in terms of what was obvious, but in terms of what was unseen." She paused, allowing the words to settle. Mr. Whitcomb's unfortunate fall revealed certain truths. Not all of them were apparent to the casual observer, but each detail, however small, contributed to the story. "For example," she said, producing the silver cufflink from her pocket with a delicate flourish, "this small item was found at the scene. It is unique, and it does not belong to the victim. Yet it tells us something important. The person who left it behind was present, close enough to interact with Mr. Whitcomb at the critical moment." A subtle murmur ran through the room. Eyes flicked between Miss Marple and the cufflink, curiosity and unease mixing in equal measure. "Now," Miss Marple continued, "one might ask why this item was left behind. Was it carelessness, or was it meant to mislead?" She allowed her gaze to sweep slowly across the villagers, noting each reaction. "Notice," she said softly, "the small gestures, the micro-expressions, the fleeting signs of consciousness and concern. Human behavior is rarely perfectly hidden." Her eyes settled on Miss Henley. "You were seen speaking with Mr. Whitcomb just before the incident, were you not? Your conversation, brief as it was, seemed charged, tense, and yet outwardly you appeared composed. Why?" Miss Henley's fingers trembled slightly around her teacup. Her eyes, for the briefest instant, betrayed recognition of knowledge, of guilt, of awareness that the careful web of observation had ensnared her. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. "And you, Mr. Pendleton, you have been careful, professional, precise, but even you cannot completely disguise the fleeting signs of conscience. A glance here, a hesitation there, small things, perhaps unnoticed by others, but telling to one who pays attention." A faint gasp escaped Lady Mayhew, and Mrs. Stokes leaned forward, captivated. Sensing the final turn of the investigation, Miss Marple continued, connecting the subtle threads with patient clarity. "The fainting incident yesterday, Mr. Hargreaves, was intended to distract attention. A clever diversion, yet not enough to mask the truth. The person who orchestrated events understood fear and timing, manipulating both to their advantage." Her gaze shifted fully to Miss Henley, whose composure now showed cracks. "Miss Henley," Miss Marple said gently, "you intended to frighten Mr. Whitcomb into silence, did you not? The discussions regarding the property, the old grievances, the knowledge that Mr. Whitcomb possessed, all created an opportunity. The cufflink, left behind in haste or in error, betrayed your presence. And the fainting of Mr. Hargreaves, a staged episode, was meant to mislead us all." The room was silent, the villagers' faces pale and attentive. Miss Henley's lips parted, her hands clenching reflexively. The first outward sign of acknowledgement. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady and composed, "the truth is seldom complicated once the human behavior is properly observed. Motive, opportunity, and subtle signs of fear or guilt converge. The careful observer can distinguish between genuine shock and staged performance, between accidental gestures and deliberate concealment." Miss Henley finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not intend—" She stopped, realizing words alone could not undo the evidence gathered in plain sight. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Intent is understood by actions and reactions, Miss Henley, more than by words. Your efforts to conceal, to manipulate fear, to orchestrate distraction, all were noted, carefully observed and understood." Mr. Pendleton, who had remained composed, finally exhaled, recognizing the pattern that Miss Marple had traced with unerring precision. Even Lady Mayhew, always mindful of decorum, nodded slightly, acknowledging the elegant clarity with which the mystery had been unravelled. Miss Marple placed the cufflink gently on the table, her eyes resting lightly on Miss Henley. "It is not harshness to reveal the truth," she said. It is merely the natural consequence of human behavior exposed to careful observation. The smallest details, the quietest signals, the unguarded gestures, these speak louder than accusations or assumptions. Miss Henley lowered her gaze, aware that her deception had been unveiled, that the intricate web she had spun had unraveled under the quiet genius of a woman who observed rather than confronted, who listened rather than interrogated. The villagers, watching the scene unfold, felt the tension release, though the lingering unease remained. They had witnessed the precision of Miss Marple's mind, the clarity of her observations, and the subtle elegance with which she had traced motive and action to their source. As Miss Marple rose, her expression serene, she reflected quietly on the nature of human behavior. Deception, she murmured to herself, is rarely perfect. Even the most careful concealment leaves traces, and those traces, when read correctly, reveal the truth more plainly than words ever could. The room, still heavy with tension, seemed to breathe collectively as the mystery reached its conclusion. Miss Marple, composed as always, had untangled the web of deceit, observed the hidden signals, and restored clarity to the village, all with gentle precision and understated genius. The following morning, St. Mary Mead was quiet, almost eerily so. The frost that had settled overnight sparkled in the pale light of dawn, and the narrow lanes glimmered with a delicate crust of ice. Though the village had returned to its ordinary rhythm on the surface, beneath the calm lingered the subtle tension left by the events of the past week. The murder at the New Year's luncheon had been resolved, but the echoes of human deceit, fear, and secrecy remained as palpable as the morning frost. Miss Marple walked through the village, her pace unhurried, her mind quietly reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The villagers went about their routines with the delicate politeness of those aware that they had witnessed a rare and sobering revelation. Shopkeepers greeted customers with a careful cheerfulness. Children skated along the edges of the frozen ponds, their laughter muted by cold air, and the familiar clop of horses' hooves along cobbled streets reminded her that life in its ordinary rhythm continued even after extraordinary disruption. Yet Miss Marple, observant as ever, noted the subtle changes. Mrs. Stokes, for example, hovered with a slightly exaggerated brightness in her manner, eager to discuss every rumor and speculation, though she now tempered her words in cautious recognition of Miss Marple's presence. The sense of caution indicated that the villagers, while relieved that the murderer had been revealed, had internalized a quiet awareness of the fragility of their social equilibrium. Lady Mayhew's household, having endured the scrutiny and revelations of the past days, was slowly returning to normal. The servants, though diligent, moved with a more subdued energy, their conversations peppered with glimpses of astonishment and lingering curiosity. Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, confided to Miss Marple that the household felt smaller somehow, as if the revelation of hidden motives and secrets had subtly altered the air itself. "The house seems different now," Mrs. Cartwright said, her voice hushed. "It is as though the walls remember more than before, and we are all more aware of one another." Miss Marple smiled gently. Human nature, she reflected, leaves traces that even architecture seems to retain. Places witness actions, and while they do not speak, they subtly influence the behavior of those who inhabit them. In the village square, conversation buzzed with cautious interest. Mr. Pendleton, his professional composure restored, offered gentle guidance to villagers curious about legal matters arising from Mr. Whitcomb's estate. Yet even he moved with a slightly more reflective air, mindful that ordinary life had been punctuated by extraordinary events. His demeanor was steady, but Miss Marple could detect the faint impression that he, too, was considering the lessons human behavior could impart when observed attentively. The young children of St. Mary Mead, oblivious to the full implications of the crime, went about their play with innocent exuberance. Miss Marple paused briefly to watch them, noting the simplicity and transparency of their gestures and expressions. She mused silently that the clarity of childhood revealed a truth often obscured in adults, the honesty of emotion, unguarded and uncalculated, which even the most careful deceiver struggles to mimic. Meanwhile, Miss Henley, the perpetrator, had been taken into custody, her composure maintained, though there were subtle cracks in her carefully constructed demeanor. The villagers had learned of her actions, Yet Miss Marple observed that the revelation had left them more contemplative than outraged. There was a collective recognition that the crime had arisen not from monstrous impulses, but from ordinary human failings: greed, envy, fear, and the desire to manipulate outcomes. As the afternoon light softened, Miss Marple returned to her own home. Sitting by the window, she reflected on the intricate web she had observed over the past days. Each action, each reaction, each micro-expression had contributed to the resolution of the crime. The cufflink, the staged fainting, the subtle gestures and glances, all were threads that, when carefully considered, revealed a coherent pattern. Human nature, in its complexity, had provided the clues she required if one only knew how to watch patiently. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the subtle lesson she believed the village had also absorbed. Deception, while it may succeed in the short term, leaves traces detectable to those who understand human behavior. People, she noted, often underestimate the observant eye, the patient mind, and the gentle but persistent power of attention. Those who trust in appearances alone are easily misled, yet those who understand the language of subtlety, glances, gestures, and hesitations, can discern the truth even amidst carefully constructed facades. The villagers, in their gradual return to normality, carried these lessons in small ways. Politeness, once habitual and automatic, was now accompanied by attentiveness. Gossip, once a casual pastime, was tempered by recognition that the unseen could be as revealing as the spoken. Miss Marple recognized that these were not conscious realizations for most, yet the subtle shift in collective awareness was undeniable. Life in St. Mary Mead had resumed, but it was now tinged with the quiet acknowledgement that beneath ordinary civility lay complex human motives, waiting to be revealed to the patient observer. Later that evening, the village pub hosted its usual gathering of locals. Conversation flowed in familiar patterns, yet Miss Marple noted how eyes occasionally flicked toward one another with a fleeting awareness of recent events. The subtle vigilance, though not explicitly recognized, had been instilled by the week's revelations. People moved with a gentle caution, a new respect for observation, and the quiet understanding that human nature, while ordinary in appearance, was capable of extraordinary consequence. As Miss Marple prepared her own modest supper, she reflected on the quiet resilience of her village. Life, she thought, continued its ordinary course, punctuated by extraordinary insights into the nature of humanity. The resolution of the crime had restored order, yet it had also revealed that even in the most peaceful settings, human behavior contains depths of complexity. She poured herself a cup of tea, settled by the fire, and mused on the nature of observation, deception, and truth. The events of the New Year's luncheon, while resolved in practical terms, would linger in memory as a reminder of both human fallibility and the subtle, persistent power of careful attention. In St. Mary Mead, life would resume polite and orderly on the surface, yet richer in understanding beneath. Miss Marple, serene and reflective, allowed herself a small, contented smile. The village had been tested, the truth revealed, and the quiet lessons of human behavior, subtle yet profound, had endured. In the gentle rhythm of her home, she found satisfaction not only in the resolution of the crime, but in the affirmation of her lifelong understanding that the heart, the mind, and the smallest gestures often tell the story more clearly than words ever could. Even after the resolution of the Luncheon murder, St. Mary Mead seemed to move with a slightly altered rhythm. The village remained picturesque, as it had always been, with cobblestone streets and thatched roofs, yet an unspoken awareness had taken root among its inhabitants. The extraordinary events had revealed the subtle tensions and secrets that lay beneath the veneer of ordinary life, and though Miss Marple had restored order, the memory of deception lingered. Miss Marple herself spent the morning quietly walking along the frost-kissed lanes, observing the villagers as they carried on with their daily routines. She noted how carefully they now exchanged greetings, how even the smallest nod or smile seemed more measured than before. People were more conscious of each other, a fact that would ensure civility but also encourage mindfulness in behavior. Miss Marple mused that the village had absorbed the lessons of the past days, however unconsciously, and that was itself a form of justice, one that did not require public acknowledgement. At the village shop, she encountered Mrs. Stokes, who greeted her with a slightly subdued enthusiasm. "Well, Miss Marple," she said, carefully folding her hands, "I dare say we are all much wiser now, aren't we? One cannot take anything at face value these days." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Indeed, Mrs. Stokes. People are often not what they seem, yet one can learn a great deal by observing the little things, the gesture of a hand, the turn of an eye, the smallest hesitation. Human nature speaks in its own subtle language." Mrs. Stokes nodded, attempting to mask both curiosity and the faint sense of guilt that her penchant for gossip often invited. "I suppose one must always keep a careful eye, even among friends," she added, though her tone hinted at realization rather than admonition. Miss Marple's next stop was the Mayhew residence. Lady Mayhew met her at the door with a graceful nod, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "I cannot thank you enough, Miss Marple," she said. "The household has been through a trying week, and your insight has prevented what might have been a far greater calamity." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "It is rarely a matter of genius, Lady Mayhew. One only needs to observe carefully, to notice the subtleties of behavior, and to understand the small patterns that emerge when people interact. The truth is often hidden in plain sight, waiting for patience and attention to reveal it." Inside, the house had returned to its usual quiet order, though subtle changes remained. Servants moved with measured diligence, aware that small actions could carry significance beyond their immediate perception. Mrs. Cartwright, the housekeeper, showed Miss Marple the rose bushes where the fainting incident had occurred. "I cannot help but feel that everything has left a trace, Miss Marple," she said softly. "Even the ground seems different now, as if it remembers what transpired." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that the observation was metaphorical, yet accurate in the sense that human memory and behavior leave lasting impressions on both people and their surroundings. "Places like people retain the echoes of past events," she said, "and those echoes often influence future actions, whether we are conscious of it or not." By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, where the quiet was punctuated only by the occasional crow and the wind whispering through bare branches. She reflected on Mr. Whitcomb, whose life had ended so abruptly, and the chain of human motives that had culminated in his death. It was not simply a matter of crime and punishment, she thought. It was a study in human frailty, ambition, and the subtle interplay of conscience, fear, and desire. She considered Miss Henley now in custody, and the manner in which the web of her deception had been unravelled. The fainting of Charles Hargreaves, the carefully placed cufflink, the psychological manipulations, all were elements of a game, in which Miss Marple had patiently observed each move, noted each reaction, and allowed human behavior to speak more plainly than words ever could. In doing so, she had restored clarity without the need for dramatics, confrontation, or coercion. Miss Marple also pondered the reactions of other villagers. Mr. Pendleton, Lady Mayhew, and even Mrs. Stokes had all been unwitting participants in a subtle dance, their actions and responses providing context, contrast, and reinforcement of the patterns she had discerned. Each person's behavior, small or significant, contributed to a larger understanding of the human condition. Observation, patience, and empathy had proven far more potent than any overt display of authority. Returning home as the light waned, Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair, the quiet comfort of her small sitting room embracing her. She reflected on the enduring lessons of the mystery, that human nature is consistent in its tendencies, that deceit rarely escapes unnoticed, and that understanding others requires both attentiveness and kindness. Knowledge of these patterns allowed one to discern truth where others saw only surface appearances. Her thoughts drifted to the future of St. Mary Mead. Life would continue, the villagers resuming their routines, yet with an added layer of awareness. Subtle tension would remain, perhaps forever, but it would be accompanied by a more careful understanding of social dynamics. People would behave more thoughtfully, perhaps, and exercise caution in their dealings. The village, while outwardly unchanged, had been quietly educated in the profound lessons of human observation. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the warmth seep into her fingers, and contemplated the gentle equilibrium that now settled over St. Mary Mead. She knew that ordinary life carried its own mysteries, that human behavior was an endless source of study, and that vigilance combined with patience could illuminate the hidden intricacies of every encounter. The events of the luncheon, while extraordinary, were merely a reflection of what occurred every day in subtler forms. Small betrayals, minor deceptions, unspoken fears, and fleeting gestures that told more than words ever could. As the fire crackled softly and the evening deepened, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice, in its most understated form, had been achieved. The village had returned to normal, yet with a subtle shift in consciousness, and she, as always, remained the silent observer, the gentle interpreter of human nature and the quiet guardian of truth in a world often masked by ordinary appearances. In that serene stillness, Miss Marple realized the profound constancy of her work: to watch, to listen, to understand, and to gently reveal the truth hidden beneath human pretenses. St. Mary Mead, peaceful once more, bore the subtle marks of insight, reflection, and the quiet triumph of observation.